She was 3 years old. She had red hair that her mother braided every morning with a piece of blue ribbon. And she had a way of pronouncing her own name, Vielle, 2 hard syllables, that made her grandmother laugh every time she said it. On the afternoon of September 3rd, 1958, Violet Ruth Nash disappeared from the front yard of her family's home on Chandler Mill Road outside Presque Isle, Maine, while her mother hung laundry on the line 20 feet away. Not a scream, not a sound. One moment she was sitting in the grass at the edge of the garden, pulling up dandelions, and the next moment she was not there. That is not a story about a toddler who wandered into the woods. That is a story about a plan, patient, specific, and executed in less than 90 seconds while a mother's back was turned. And it would take 66 years, a retired school teacher in a nursing home in coastal Georgia, and a single sentence spoken during a routine health intake interview to finally bring the truth out into the September light where it belonged. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that afternoon in Aroostook County. Because to understand what was given back, you first have to understand what was stolen. Aroostook County in the fall of 1958 was potato country, the largest potato-growing region east of Idaho, they said. And the people there said it with the particular pride of communities that have built something real from difficult ground. The fields in September ran in long brown rows to the tree line in every direction. And the smell of harvest was a mix of turned earth and cold air coming off the Canadian border that every person who grew up there carried somewhere in their memory for the rest of their lives. School started late in Aroostook County. It started late because children were needed in the fields, which was not an inconvenience but a fact of life that the community had organized itself around for generations. Thomas Nash worked the 40-acre potato farm his own father had left him on Chandler Mill Road. And he worked it the way northern Maine farmers worked things in 1958. With a neighbor's help when the harvest was heavy and a returned favor when it wasn't. With a party line telephone that rang twice for his house and 3 times for the Pelletiers next door. And with the unspoken understanding that the road they lived on was safe. Because it had always been safe, and there was no particular reason to believe otherwise. Eleanor Nash had grown up 3 roads over, the daughter of a dairy farmer, and had married Thomas at 21 and moved into the farmhouse that still smelled like his mother's cooking, and which she had made her own over 7 years, with a rag rug in the kitchen and curtains she had sewn herself from fabric she ordered out of the Sears catalog. They had 2 children. Margaret was 6 and in 1st grade. Violet was 3, and at the age where the entire world was something to pull out of the ground and examine. Violet was not a cautious child. She moved through the world with a kind of absolute confidence in her own safety that 3-year-olds have when they have never had reason to feel otherwise. She called the family's barn cat Gerald. She could identify a potato plant by its leaves. She was, by any account of anyone who remembered her, entirely and specifically herself. Not a generic small child, but a particular one, with her red braids and her hard syllables and her grandmother's laughter following her from room to room. That afternoon was one of those Maine September days that felt like a gift. Still warm, the fields golden, the sky the particular blue that only appears for about 3 weeks in late summer before the cold comes for good. Eleanor had put Violet in the yard while she took in the laundry from the line behind the house. The clothes line was 20 feet from the garden. She had done it 100 times. She had never done it again. Eleanor finished the last of the sheets at approximately 2:40 in the afternoon and turned around with the empty basket on her hip. The yard was empty. She called Violet's name, set the basket down, called again the particular way a mother calls when she is not yet frightened, but is moving that direction fast. She walked to the garden fence. She walked to the barn. She called for Gerald the cat as if the cat might answer what the child could not. By 2:50, she was running. She checked the root cellar. She checked the barn loft. She walked the edge of the field, calling, while the rows stretched out before her with their brown leaves and their silence. By 3:15, she was at the Pelletier farm. By 3:30, the party line was moving the information from house to house, the way bad news always moved. Faster than anything good ever did. Thomas Nash was pulling into the driveway at 4 o'clock when he saw the neighbors gathering in the road. He got out of the truck and looked at his wife's face, and he did not ask where Violet was because he already understood from her face that nobody knew. The Maine State Police were called at 4:20. Troopers were on the road by 5. By dark, the search party stretched across 3 farms in both directions from the Nash property. Lanterns moving through the potato rows like slow fireflies. They searched through the night and into the next day. What was found on the morning of September 4th was not Violet. What was found was the blue hair ribbon, the one Eleanor had braided in that morning, lying in the dirt of the gravel shoulder on the far side of Chandler Mill Road, 20 yards north of the Nash driveway. Not near the garden, not near the barn. Across the road, in the gravel, where a vehicle might have been parked. Trooper Gerald Thibodeau of the Presque Isle Barracks photographed it, bagged it, and noted in his report that the ribbon's position suggested the child had been carried, not walked, to that location. The report was thorough. The conclusion was filed. Nobody canvassed the full length of Chandler Mill Road that first day for vehicles that didn't belong. It was harvest season, and there were trucks everywhere, and Violet was still missing. And there was too much ground to cover before dark fell again. Sergeant Armand Blanchette of the Maine State Police had been stationed in Presque Isle for 6 years when Violet Nash disappeared. And he was the kind of investigator who trusted his instincts in the way that men who have been wrong often enough learn to distrust them, carefully, with documentation, and with a healthy respect for what he didn't know. He was 38 in the fall of 1958, a Lewiston native who had come to Aroostook County on a temporary posting that had simply never ended, the way things sometimes don't. In the first 2 weeks, Blanchette developed 2 persons of interest. The first was a seasonal crop worker named Bertrand Auger, who had been employed on the Holton farm adjacent to the Nash property, and who had been seen by a neighbor walking on Chandler Mill Road on the afternoon of September 3rd. Auger was brought in within the week, questioned over 2 days, and eliminated when 4 fellow workers confirmed he had been loading trucks on the Holton property at the time in question, and when his physical description, 6'2", heavy set, did not match the tire impression evidence that was, by then, beginning to draw Blanchette's attention. A partial track in the gravel near the ribbon had been cast. The wheelbase was narrow. The tires were worn smooth on the inside edge. A smaller vehicle. The second name came from a tip. A neighbor 2 miles up the road who said she had seen an unfamiliar blue car parked on the shoulder of Chandler Mill Road on the morning of September 3rd, before noon, idling. She had not thought anything of it. She had not gotten a plate. She could say it was American-made, older, and blue, and that the driver appeared to be a man, and that was the extent of what she had seen. Blanchette spent 3 months trying to find that blue car. He checked registrations in Aroostook County. He checked with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police across the border. He put out a bulletin through the state system. The car did not materialize. Eleanor Nash, meanwhile, had done what the mothers in these cases always did when the official channels ran dry. She had called everyone she could think of and written to everyone she couldn't reach by phone. She wrote to the state's congressional delegation. She wrote to the National Missing Children's Foundation, which did not exist yet, so the letter came back. She wrote to the editor of the Presque Isle Star-Herald, who published a notice in 3 consecutive issues. She left Violet's photograph at the general store in Mapleton at the post office in Mars Hill, at the diner in Caribou. Thomas Nash nailed a photograph to the telephone pole at the end of the driveway. He replaced it every spring when the winter had destroyed the previous one. He never stopped. Sergeant Blanchette's investigation formally closed in 1961, 3 years in, with no arrest and no resolution. He wrote a summary of the case that was 2 pages long and notably direct for a 1961 police document. He believed a vehicle had been used, that the driver had observed the Nash property over a period of days before the disappearance, and that Violet was most likely alive and held by individuals who could not have children of their own. He filed this summary. He retained a personal copy. He was not asked about the case again by the department for 11 years. The years that follow a disappearance have a particular texture that is different from other kinds of grief. It is not the grief of loss, exactly, because the question remains open and the answer might still come. But it is not the grief of hope either, because hope that is never resolved becomes its own kind of wound. By 1965, 7 years had passed. Margaret Nash was 13 and had grown up in a house where the subject of her sister was always present and always unresolved. A permanent absence that shaped the family the way a missing support beam shapes a structure. Thomas kept the photograph on the telephone pole. Eleanor kept Violet's room the way it was. The small quilt, the stuffed rabbit, the braided rug, not as a shrine but as a placeholder, a room waiting for an occupant who had not yet returned. By 1972, 14 years on, Sergeant Blanchette had transferred to the Augusta headquarters and kept his copy of the case file in the bottom drawer of his desk. His wife knew it was there. His supervisors did not ask about it. He reviewed it without announcement on the first Thursday of every October. By 1985, Thomas Nash died of a heart attack at 63. He had spent 27 years replacing the photograph on the telephone pole. Eleanor told her daughter afterward that he had never once gone a full day without thinking about Violet. Not one. By 1994, 36 years on, the quilt in Violet's room had been carefully folded and stored. Eleanor was 71 and living with Margaret in Bangor. The farmhouse on Chandler Mill Road had passed out of the family. But Eleanor Nash had done one thing before she left the farm for the last time that would matter more than she could have known. She had written down everything she remembered about that afternoon, in her own handwriting, in a spiral notebook, and she had given it to Margaret with instructions to keep it safe. Every detail: the laundry, the basket, the garden, the blue ribbon, the particular quality of the silence when she turned around. Margaret kept the notebook. Eleanor Nash died in 2003. She was 80 years old. She had never stopped believing her daughter was somewhere. Every case on this channel comes from weeks of digging, through records, old files, faded documents, and the memories of families who never let go. If you want us to keep telling stories like Violet's, take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now, let's get back to Violet. The case had been cold for 63 years when a social worker named Deb Arsenault, conducting a routine health intake interview at a nursing home in Brunswick, Georgia, in the spring of 2021, asked an elderly resident a standard question about her birthplace. The woman's answer did not match her records. The resident's name on file was Ruth Elaine Cormier, 86 years old, originally from Savannah, Georgia, according to documents that had accompanied her into the system decades earlier. She was cognitively sharp but physically limited, and she had lived in the Brunswick facility for 3 years. She was, by the staff's account, a private person, not unfriendly, but contained in a way that suggested a life spent keeping things organized and in order. When Deb Arsenault asked about her birthplace, the woman paused. Then she said that she had been told she was from Georgia, but that she did not believe that was true. That there were things she remembered: cold, snow that lasted all winter, the smell of a field being turned over in the fall. That did not match anything about the South. That she had a feeling, which she had carried her whole life and never spoken about, that something had happened to her when she was very small, and that she did not know what it was. Deb Arsenault was not a cold case investigator. She was a social worker doing an intake form. But she was also, as she would say later in an interview, someone who had been doing this job for 22 years and who had learned to write things down when something didn't add up. She wrote it down. It took 8 months, 3 separate inquiries, and a referral to the Maine State Police Cold Case Unit before the connection to the Nash case was formally established. The DNA process that bridged the gap works by comparing a biological sample from an unidentified person against samples submitted by biological relatives in public genealogy databases, the same ancestry websites that ordinary people use to trace their family trees, and identifying overlapping genetic markers that point back to a shared family line. Margaret Nash's daughter had submitted a sample to one of those databases in 2019 on a whim, because she was curious about her ancestry. The match was identified by cold case analyst Teresa Mora of the Maine State Police in January of 2022, on a Wednesday morning, while reviewing a cross-referenced genetic genealogy report. She stared at the result for a long time before she reached for the phone. The familial line ran clearly from the Brunswick nursing home resident through Margaret Nash's daughter back to Eleanor and Thomas Nash of Chandler Mill Road, Presque Isle, Maine. Teresa Morin called Margaret Nash in Bangor at 8:17 in the morning. Margaret, who was 70 years old and had spent 66 years as the surviving sister of a missing child, picked up the phone on the first ring. The investigation into how Violet Nash had come to be Ruth Elaine Cormier proceeded carefully over a period of months, in coordination with Georgia and Maine authorities. What the records and the subsequent interviews revealed was this: the man who had taken Violet from the yard on Chandler Mill Road was a 41-year-old itinerant laborer named Chester Aldrich, originally from Calais-Moutoulet, Maine, who had been working seasonal harvest jobs across Aroostook County in the fall of 1958, and who had driven, as Sergeant Blanchette had believed since 1961, a blue 1951 Plymouth sedan with worn inside-edge tires. The narrow wheelbase of that Plymouth matched the cast impression from the gravel shoulder within margins that a modern forensic engineer confirmed in a 2022 analysis of Blanchette's original photographs. Aldrich had delivered Violet to a couple in Savannah, Georgia. Philip and Naomi Cormier, childless, distantly related to Aldrich through a family connection in Washington County. Sometime in the late fall of 1958, he had told them the child was the orphan devoir daughter of a distant relative. The Cormiers, investigators believe, understood enough to know they should not ask for documentation, and in the Georgia of 1958, in a new city with a new name and a couple who presented as church-going and established, no one looked closely. Ruth Elaine Cormier had started school in Savannah in 1961. Chester Aldrich died in a logging accident in New Brunswick, Canada, in 1967. Philip Cormier died in 1979. Naomi Cormier died in 1991. There was no arrest to be made. What investigators could do, and did, in the spring of 2022, in a conference room at the Brunswick nursing home with Margaret Nash and a patient advocate present, was give Violet Nash, now 86 years old, the truth about her first 3 years of life. Her name, her parents, the farm on Chandler Mill Road, the blue ribbon, the sound of her grandmother laughing when she said her own name, the way she always said it. Court records document that Violet Nash listened to the presentation without speaking for a very long time. When she did speak, what she said was that the cold made sense now. That she had always dreamed about cold she couldn't explain, and that now she knew where it had come from. And then she asked about the smell of the fields in September, and Margaret told her about harvest season in Aroostook County, and about the potato rows and the turned earth and the cold air off the Canadian border. And something in Violet Nash's face, at 86 years old, seemed to recognize something it had been looking for since 1958. The case of Violet Nash has changed two things in the state of Maine in ways that outlast any single investigation. The first is a protocol, now formally adopted by the Maine State Police, that cross-references long-term missing persons cases against unidentified or ambiguously documented nursing home residents on a biennial basis. A program built specifically because a social worker named Deb Arsenault wrote something down on an intake form. The second is a memorial that Margaret Nash's family placed at the end of Chandler Mill Road in 2023, near the telephone pole where Thomas Nash nailed a photograph every spring for 27 years until the day he died. Violet Nash is 89 years old in 2026. She has met Margaret and Margaret's children and Margaret's grandchildren, who are her family and who were strangers to her until 4 years ago. She has been back to Maine once. She stood at the edge of what used to be the Nash farm and looked out across the fields and did not say much. But Margaret, who was standing next to her, said later that it was the most present she had ever seen another person be in a single moment, like someone arriving somewhere they had been trying to get to for a very long time. Eleanor Nash braided blue ribbon into her daughter's hair every morning for 3 years. She kept the room. She kept the notebook. She wrote down every detail of every afternoon that she could summon, and she gave it to her surviving daughter with instructions to keep it safe. She never knew what the notebook would eventually do. She only knew that the details mattered and that someone needed to have them written down. She was right. I want to ask you something before we go. Chester Aldrich died in 1967, and the Cormiers are gone. When the people responsible are unreachable, does knowing the truth still feel like justice? Or does justice require something more? What moment in this story affected you the most? Blanchette's summary that nobody asked him about for 11 years? Or Violet's comment about the cold she could never explain? And what does it say about the systems meant to protect children that a 3-year-old could be renamed and redocumented in 1958 with no one asking a single question? Violet Nash came home after 66 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth finding, no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.